They called me the family failure. I never corrected them. Not when they dismissed my work, not when they smiled through silence at every dinner. But at my brother's engagement party, while I sat in the shadows like a faded photograph, his fiancée looked across the table and said, "Wait, you're the founder." And in that moment, everything changed. My name is Ava Reynolds. I'm 31 years old. I live in a quiet apartment above a bookstore in Seattle. I make my own coffee, pay my own bills, and answer to no one except the landlord when the rent is late by a day. On paper, I'm independent. On paper, I'm fine. But in my family's eyes, I'm the disappointment. I wasn't always. There was a time when I was the one they bragged about at weddings and dinner parties. Ava's in meds, my mother woo. And there was no scandal, no nervous breakdown, no reckless spiral, just depletion. A slow, quiet hollowing that I didn't have the words for until much later. I stopped sleeping. I started shaking. I'd stare at textbooks like they were written in a language I used to speak. My hands were steady in the lab, but my soul was trembling. And still I smiled at Thanksgiving, laughed at jokes, pretended I was just tired, not unraveling. When I finally dropped out, I didn't even cry. I just packed my things, boarded a train west, and moved into a city where no one knew who I was supposed to be. Here so. Back home silence did the talking. My father didn't call. My mother cried quietly, behind closed doors, and told friends I was taking a break. Break. As if I'd be, but it woo. The day I left med school was the day I became invisible. The shift was subtle at first, fewer phone calls, more cautious questions. The how's school S became, "So, what are you doing now?" with polite tilts of the head and tight smiles that didn't reach the eyes. At family dinners, Grant started carrying the torch finance major fast-tracked promotions, polished girlfriend from a fam. My mother still invites me to things, sends dress codes and group emails. Nothing too dark this time, she'll write. Something more feminine. A code I've come to understand. In their minds, I was brilliant until I wasn't. Strong until I wavered. Exceptional until I chose peace over pressure. I don't think they ever understood that I didn't leave medicine because I couldn't handle it. I left because it was killing me in a way no autopsy could have proved. Now I live above a bookstore in Capitol Hill. The floors creak. The heater rattles like it's full of ghosts. My bedroom window faces west, and when it rains, the city feels like it's whispering just to me. I teach seniors how to use technology, email, video calls, online safety. At first it was for cash, now it's for connection. But that part of the story didn't make it into the family newsletter. No one asks about my days anymore. They just tell my story for me. Ava burned out. She needed space. She's still figuring things out. But here's the truth, I didn't burn out. I woke up. What I feel now isn't failure. It's clarity. I was never built to climb a ladder someone else placed in front of me. I was meant to build something of my own. Something slower. Something quieter. Something lasting. But when you don't follow the script, especially as a woman in a family that worships achievement, you don't just fall from grace. You disappear from the narrative entirely. There's a loneliness in that kind of erasure. It's not loud. It's not cruel. It's neglect, dressed up as politeness. Smiles that skip over you. Conversations you're not included in. The kind of silence that says, "We're still proud of who you used to be." I've learned something in that silence. Failure isn't always a collapse. Sometimes it's just the sound of everyone turning the page while you're still on the same paragraph, rereading your lines, deciding if they still feel like yours. And if they don't, you write new ones. That's what I'm doing now. Writing a new story sentence by sentence. One they'll never ask about. One they won't understand until it introduces itself. And maybe by then I won't need their understanding. Because sometimes not being seen by the people who once defined you is the first step toward finally seeing yourself. The first time I showed someone how to send an email, it took nearly an hour. Her name was Ruth. 76 years old, wore a sky blue cardigan with tiny embroidered birds on the collar. She kept apologizing for being slow. I kept telling her she wasn't. We sat in the back corner of a coffee shop, two mismatched chairs tucked around a sticky table. Her hands trembled slightly as she hovered over the trackpad, eyes squinting at the screen. But when she finally hit send and saw her daughter's reply pop up seconds later, she gasped like someone had just opened a door to another world. She answered. She whispered, hand fluttering to her chest. I haven't spoken to her in weeks. She started to cry. I looked away, gave her space, then slid over a napkin without saying a word. Ruth wiped her eyes and looked at me like I had handed her a miracle. That night, I walked home in the drizzle, something tugging at the edge of my heart. It wasn't pride. It was something quieter, like purpose. Like maybe all this detouring and disappointment had led me somewhere real. I'd taken the tutoring job out of necessity. Rent didn't wait for life purpose. A local community board was looking for someone to teach basic internet skills to seniors. I had free time, a patient voice, and just enough tech knowledge to fake confidence. I applied. What started as a side gig became a rhythm, then a routine, then a calling. Week by week, the back corners of coffee shops turned into tiny classrooms. I taught password security, photo sharing, online banking, even how to FaceTime. One man nearly fell out of his chair the first time he saw his grandkids waving on the screen. Another woman, Dolores, called the laptop a metal anxiety machine, but ended up baking me banana bread when she successfully booked her own doctor's appointment online. There was no applause, no promotions, no one sent emails of praise. But they hugged me, they called me darling and honey, and the computer angel. They invited me to birthdays, sent me thank you cards with shaky handwriting and big hearts. And for the first time since leaving med school, I felt needed not for what I was supposed to become, but for what I could actually give. Still, I kept it quiet. I didn't tell my family about the banana bread or Ruth's tears. I didn't explain the sense of peace I felt walking into a public library to set up folding chairs and loaner iPads. I didn't think they'd get it. To them, I was doing a little teaching thing, just something temporary. Another phase in the long, strange spiral away from the path they'd chosen for me. They'd stopped asking the kind of questions that meant they were listening. Now they just nodded politely, like checking a box. Yes, Ava's still out there, doing something. But while they smiled and passed the potatoes, I was building something. It started as a shared Google Drive full of lesson plans and printable guides. Then a few YouTube walkthroughs for my students who forgot how to log in. Jamie, one of my youngest attendees, a 60-year-old veteran with arthritis, suggested I put the videos in one place. So I did. I called it Elder Path. The name came to me one morning while watching a woman named Cynthia type out a Facebook comment with 2 fingers and a look of fierce concentration. Her late husband had built trails in Oregon. She said he believed every person deserved a path forward, even the ones who didn't walk fast. That stuck with me. Elder Path wasn't shiny or revolutionary. It was simple, warm, and clear. Just a platform to help people navigate the digital world without shame or frustration. It had tutorials, a clean interface, oversized buttons, and friendly voiceovers. Nothing complicated, nothing condescending. The world didn't notice. But the people I built it for did. We added a chat support tool, then live webinars, then a mini course on how to spot phishing scams. One user called me to say she'd helped her friend cancel a fake subscription scam because of something she learned in my little course. I didn't correct her. I just said I was proud of her. Because I was. Meanwhile, my family continued to misunderstand me with impressive consistency. At a family lunch, I mentioned how one of my clients, an 82-year-old woman, had used ElderPath to apply for a passport online so she could meet her great-grandchild. That's sweet, my mother said, refilling water glasses. I always thought you'd do something with people. I almost laughed. She didn't mean it as an insult, but she didn't mean it as a compliment either. She didn't ask about the platform, didn't ask how many users we had, 20,000 at the time, didn't ask how I funded it, 2 grants and a small team of volunteers. She just kept setting the table. I used to ache for their validation. I used to rehearse how I'd explain what ElderPath really was, how it mattered. But eventually I stopped, not because it didn't hurt, but because I realized something: their silence didn't make my work invisible. It only made them blind to it. And maybe, just maybe, that was their loss. My brother Grant never needed to be loud to be seen. He just showed up with polished shoes and the right answers. Where I had questions, he had charts. Where I broke down quietly in my second year of med school, he glided through his finance degree without a single misstep. He wasn't unkind. He just didn't have to be. People made space for him automatically. By the time he was 28, he had a corner office at a tech investment firm, a sleek apartment downtown, and a fiancée who came from a family that spoke in generations of schools, of yachts, of reputations. Her name was Lila. She wore neutrals, used words like intuitive UX, and seemed born knowing which wine went with halibut. My mother adored her. At family dinners, conversation naturally curved around Grant, like sunlight through a well-angled window. His work, his world, his wins. They asked questions. They leaned in. They laughed in that easy way people do when they already believe you're doing something important. And me, I smiled. Passed the potatoes. Asked about the wedding planning. No one asked about ElderPath. Not the new feature we'd launched for users with Parkinson's. Not the community center pilot in Yakima. Not the 40,000 users who now logged in weekly. Not even a vague "how's your thing going?" Just silence. That kind of silence doesn't roar. It erodes. Slowly. Casually. Like wind smoothing stone. One evening, seated across from a roast beef, and Lila's radiant smile, my mother said it again. The phrase she used when people asked what Ava was doing now. Grant's always been the focused one. Ava's more of a free spirit. She said it with a half smile, polite, effortlessly dismissive, her fork poised in her hand, carving through her words as if they had no weight. Free spirit. I hate that phrase. In American families, it's code. It means you didn't turn out the way we hoped. It's a neat way of excusing your choices while maintaining conversational civility. It's a sugar cube wrapped around a knife. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain. I just cut my carrots and nodded like I wasn't bleeding, because that's what disappointments do. We stay polite. We stay invisible. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that twist in my chest, the old ache of being seen, but not really. Being mentioned but not asked about. I remember the first time I felt it. I was 17. It was a Tuesday night. I'd forgotten my textbook on the kitchen counter and crept back downstairs to get it. My parents were in the dining room, lights low, voices hushed. She's not like Grant. My mother said the words slow and deliberate. She's sensitive. She's strong, my father replied, but he didn't sound convinced. She tries, she said, but she always takes things so personally. If med school is as hard as it sounds, what if it breaks her? I stood in the hallway, holding my biology book, the spine pressing into my ribs. What if it breaks her? That question settled into my bones and stayed. I didn't realize until much later how many decisions I made trying to prove it wrong. Even now, 15 years later, I feel it sometimes the way they hold Grant's story up like a template while mine is a deviation. Grant's LinkedIn is bookmarked on my dad's laptop. My platform, my work still lives in the fog of her internet project. To them, his world is legible. Mine is an abstract painting they don't know how to interpret. But what they don't see, what they never asked about, is that the work I do builds bridges, not just balance sheets. That roast beef dinner I watched as Lila showed my mom photos of her mother's estate in Cape Cod. Everyone smiled. I refilled the water glasses. No one noticed when I slipped away to check my phone. There was a message from a woman named June, a caregiver in Wisconsin. She'd used ElderPath to help her father video call his brother in Arizona before his memory faded completely. We hadn't heard him laugh like that in years. I don't know how to thank you. I read it 3 times, then I put my phone away and went back to the table. Not because they asked, but because I was still someone who showed up even when I wasn't invited to speak. Maybe that was the quietest kind of strength. The video came through late, on a Wednesday. Subject line: stories that shine. Submission: Mrs. Ellis. I almost didn't click it. I was behind on emails finalizing a grant proposal and troubleshooting a login issue for a user in Idaho who kept typing her username in the password field. My brain was tired, my tea had gone cold. But something about the name tugged at me. Familiar? Grounded. I clicked. The screen lit up with soft light and warm voices. A woman mid-30s professional but gentle sat beside an older woman with a soft lavender sweater and eyes like polished sea glass. "This is my grandmother, Margaret Ellis." The younger woman began holding her grandmother's hand. "She lost my grandfather last spring. It was a really lonely time for her." I leaned forward. But thanks to Elder Path, she was able to stay in touch with all of us. Video calls, group chats, even online grocery orders. It gave her back her confidence. And it gave us her. Mrs. Ellis smiled at the camera, shy but sure. At the end of the 90-second clip, she looked directly into the lens and whispered, "Thank you, Ava. You helped me feel human again." The screen froze on her face. A single frame that held more grace than any award I'd ever dreamed of. I sat back in my chair silent. The woman in the video, Margaret's granddaughter, was Lila, Grant's fiancée. She had no idea who I was. No idea I was the woman who passed the potatoes while everyone asked Grant about market trends. No idea that the platform she was praising had been built in a borrowed library basement with no budget and a second-hand laptop. She just knew it had helped her family. And that was enough. I didn't tell anyone about the video. Not Grant, not my parents. I didn't forward it or play it at family dinner. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require amplification. They just need to be held. The next day, I watched it again, in the quiet of my office sunlight pouring through the window like soft approval. My office wasn't much a corner nook in a co-working space downtown, the kind of place where people brought their dogs and drank oat milk lattes while debugging back-end errors. My desk had a cracked mug of pens, a plant named Frankie, and a rotating calendar of quotes from women who built things without asking for permission. I watched the video again this time, not for confirmation, but for nourishment. Then I closed my laptop. Jamie arrived a few minutes later, breathless from biking hair tucked under a knit cap. 19, brilliant, still figuring out how to speak with confidence. She was our newest intern, part of a scholarship program through the state university. "You okay?" she asked, setting down her bag. "You look kind of lit up." I smiled. "Just saw something beautiful." Jamie grinned, sliding into the chair across from me. "Is it weird that I think this place is magic?" "What do you mean I don't know? Every time I leave here I feel like I'm doing something that matters, even if it's just helping Mrs. Pritchard figure out how to send cat videos." She said it casually, but her eyes were serious. Admiring. I looked at her, really looked. And it hit me quietly but completely. She sees me. Not because she had to. Not because I demanded it. But because people who build things from scratch recognize each other's hands in the foundation. Jamie respected me not for what I used to be or who my family thought I should have been, but for what I actually did, day after day, patiently, precisely, with heart and code and courage. And somehow that mattered more than anything my family might have said over Sunday roast. I'd spent years trying to prove my worth to people who wouldn't have known what to do with it, even if I served it to them on a platter. But here in this quiet office with sticky notes and slow Wi-Fi and young women like Jamie, I was seen. And it wasn't performative. It was real. Later that afternoon, Jamie asked if she could record a quick tutorial with me for our Getting Started series. We sat side by side walking through screen readers and voice commands. She introduced me on camera as Ava Reynolds, founder of Elder Path. She said it so simply, like it was obvious. Like of course I had built something meaningful. I didn't flinch, I didn't apologize. I just nodded and said, happy to be here. Because I was. Fully. Finally. Strangers were seeing my light even as my own family fumbled in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, I no longer needed them to catch up. The restaurant was the kind where the lighting was low on purpose, and the appetizers had truffle foam. The kind of place where you spoke in measured tones and napkins were folded like origami. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always do, early enough to be polite, not important. My mother looked up from her seat at the far end of the long table and blinked in surprise. "Oh, you came? You asked me to," I said simply. "Well," she said, smoothing the front of her blouse. "I'm glad." She wasn't. I could see it in the too-tight smile, the glance at my dress like it had said something inappropriate. I had chosen it carefully, dark, emerald green, sleeveless, clean lines. Not black, not a pantsuit. Not feminine in the way she preferred, but entirely mine. It didn't ask for approval. It simply existed. I found my place near the edge of the table. Just close enough to be included, just far enough to be forgettable. Grant and Lila arrived 15 minutes later, glowing, polished, a couple curated for applause. Lila made the rounds with practiced warmth, hugging relatives, complimenting centerpieces. She hugged me too, a friendly automatic gesture. No flicker of recognition. Not yet. I smiled and took a sip of water. I didn't come for validation. I came because a woman I'd never met once whispered, "You helped me feel human again." That was enough. Dinner unfolded like a well-rehearsed scene. Toasts were made, glasses clinked. Grant's boss stood and said something expensive-sounding about legacy and leadership. Lila's father offered a brief history of their family's Ivy League bloodline. I nodded along, silent, invisible, the role I'd rehearsed for years. Until dessert. Lila leaned toward me casually, a curious tilt to her head. "I've been meaning to ask Ava, what is it you do again?" It wasn't malicious. Just genuine curiosity, the kind that finally pierced the surface. The air changed just slightly. My mother stiffened across the table. My father's hand paused mid-reach for his wine. Grant looked down at his plate. I set down my fork. I run a platform for digital literacy, mainly for older adults. Lila's eyebrows lifted. "Oh, like tech classes, sort of," I said calmly. "We specialize in adaptive systems for long-term engagement, accessibility features, screen readers, large print navigation, speech input. The works." She blinked. A pause. Then, "What's it called, Elder Path?" There was a beat. And then the recognition bloomed in her eyes, like the moment before a storm breaks. "No. No way." Her voice was quiet but sharp. "Your Elder Path." I nodded once. "I founded it." She covered her mouth with one hand, looked at Grant, then back at me. "You're the Ava Reynolds from the Stories That Shine campaign. That's you." Now, the room didn't just fall silent, it stopped breathing. My mother's fork hovered in midair. My uncle coughed into his napkin. My cousin leaned forward just slightly. My grandma Lila said softly, "She used Elder Path every week until she passed. You helped her video call our family every Sunday. You gave us more time with her." She stared at me, stunned. "I submitted a video to your campaign." I smiled gently. "I know. I saw it. It meant a lot." Lila stood up slowly, visibly shaken. "Why didn't you say anything?" "It wasn't the right time," I said. She turned to the rest of the table, still standing. "I don't think any of you understand. This woman built a national program from scratch. She's been featured on NPR, on Forbes. She's changing lives." Aunt Linda gasped. Uncle Joe cleared his throat. My father looked at his glass like it might explain something. My mother opened her mouth, closed it again. The shift was seismic, but I didn't move. I didn't need to. Lila sat back down, still looking at me like I was someone she thought she'd never meet. "I can't believe it," she murmured. "You helped my family. My grandma never called herself smart until she used your site." I said nothing, just nodded. "Let the moment settle." Across the table, Grant leaned toward me. His voice was low. I didn't know." I looked at him, calm, steady. "You never asked." That silence, the one that used to feel cold and dismissive, suddenly felt like awe. For the rest of the evening, people whispered, but not behind my back. Toward me. Toasts started, including phrases like Ava's incredible work. My name, which had always been skipped over like a footnote, was suddenly spoken with care. My mother sat still, reeling like someone watching a puzzle fall together in a way they didn't expect and couldn't undo. I didn't gloat. I didn't perform. I just existed, finally, in full view. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The next morning, my phone buzzed at 7:12 a.m. The screen lit up with a single text from Grant. "I'm sorry I never asked. No emojis, no justifications. Just that. Simple. Clear." I stared at it for a while, then set the phone down screen side down and poured myself a cup of coffee. The message wasn't wrong, but it wasn't revolutionary either. It wasn't going to undo the years he'd watched me disappear under the weight of silence. It wasn't going to replay all the moments at family dinners when my name was mentioned, like background music there, but not meant to be listened to. But it was a beginning. Mid-morning, my phone rang again. Mom. Then again a few hours later. I didn't pick up. Not out of spite. I just didn't trust the version of me she might reach on the other end. I didn't want to hear her voice dressed in casual dismissal again. I didn't want to give her the space to soften the moment that had happened, to reduce it to misunderstanding or surprise. Some things deserve to stay intact. Instead, I took a long walk down the pier. The Seattle air was sharp, laced with pine and salt, and that quiet stillness only gray skies know how to hold. I didn't think. I didn't rehearse what I'd say if she called a third time. I just let the silence do what it never had the chance to do before heal. 3 days later, I came home to a white envelope wedged between a takeout flyer and a mailer for new blinds. It had no return address. Just my name in handwriting I hadn't seen in a long time, looped elegant maternal. I opened it at the kitchen table. Dear Ava. I watched the video Lila sent me, the one with her grandmother. I cried, not just because of what you've built, but because I realized I never bothered to ask. I was so focused on what you walked away from that I never looked at what you were walking toward. You did what no one in this family ever had the courage to do. You failed and kept going. You taught people how to find their voices again, including me. Love, Mom. I read it 3 times, then folded it slowly and placed it beside my desk. Not framed, not highlighted, just kept. Because this time, I didn't need to hang proof on a wall. I was living it. The next morning, I opened Elderpath to a testimonial submission from a 92-year-old man in Montana. He'd used our platform to apply for his first passport so he could fly to meet his great-granddaughter. "I've never flown before," he wrote. "Thank you for giving me the first step." That same morning, I was asked to give a keynote at a small Tech for Good conference in Spokane. Nothing big, no cameras, just 60 people in a recreation center with notebooks and hope. I said yes. At the event, I told the truth. I told them I wasn't supposed to be here, that I was supposed to be someone else. But life had other plans, and I stopped arguing with them. When the room stood to applaud, I didn't cry, but I smiled. Not the tight, polite smile I used to wear like armor. The kind that reaches your spine, the kind that says, "I made it." And I didn't need permission. That night, back at my apartment, I stood at the window as the city lights blinked softly beneath the rain. My desk light was still on. Beside it, the folded letter rested like a finished sentence. Not closure, just truth. And for the first time, I realized something I hadn't dared believe before. I no longer needed my family to understand me in order to be whole. Because sometimes the story you've been telling in silence finally echoes back. Not in applause, but in acknowledgement. Quiet. Earned. Undeniable. The folding chairs squeaked. The lights buzzed overhead. Someone had taped the words "Community Tech for Good" in uneven letters above the stage. It was all mismatched, a little dusty and full of heart. And it was mine. I stood behind the podium in a rec center auditorium with 60 people watching. Not investors, not executives. Just educators, librarians, volunteers, and the kind of people who still believed in eye contact and handwritten notes. A few held spiral notebooks. A few just held hope. I took a breath and began. I wasn't supposed to be here, I said. I was supposed to be someone else. They listened. I was supposed to be a doctor, a name on a brass plate, a story my mother could tell at dinner parties. A small smile pulled at the corners of my mouth, but that story didn't belong to me. And for a long time, I thought that meant I didn't belong anywhere. I talked about burnout, about rebuilding, about starting with one email lesson in a coffee shop and ending up with a platform that had reached over 250,000 seniors across the country. I spoke not in buzzwords, but in names. Margaret Ellis June from Wisconsin, the veteran who FaceTimed his grandson for the first time. I talked about purpose. Not the loud kind, the steady kind. When I finished, the applause was soft, but real. I didn't need a standing ovation. I didn't even need to look up. I just stood there, hands on the podium, heart steady. I had spoken the truth, and it was enough. Afterward, a woman with short gray hair and a clipboard approached me. "Thank you," she said, "for making us feel like this work matters." "It does," I replied. "It always has." 2 days later, I was at a sunlit cafe on Capitol Hill when I saw her again, Lila. She was already seated, a notebook open next to her latte. No performance this time, just sincerity. "I've been thinking," she said. "There's a foundation I volunteer with. They fund social impact startups, especially ones led by women." She slid the notebook toward me. Inside notes, names, numbers. A roadmap. "If you're ready to scale," she said, "I think we can help." I stared at the pages, then back at her. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "This isn't about owing," she replied. "It's about believing." I blinked. Old instincts flared, deflect, downplay, dodge. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I nodded. "I'll think about it," I said. Lila smiled. "That's all I ask." When she left, I sat at the table a while longer, sunlight pooling around my coffee cup. I flipped through the pages again. Grants, partnerships, community pilots. It was everything I had once tried to piece together alone, now offered with open hands. I thought about how easy it would have been to say no, to stay small, to keep building behind the curtain. But I was tired of acting like my work only mattered if it was quiet. That night I found myself remembering something I hadn't thought about in years. Second semester, first year of med school. We were studying diagnostics, and I had asked a question that didn't quite land. After class, my professor pulled me aside. "You're bright," he said, kind but condescending, "but fragile." At the time, I took it as both compliment and warning. I wore the word fragile like it was a diagnosis. Something I had to prove wrong. Something I had to outgrow. Now sitting at my kitchen table in Seattle, I whispered it out loud. Fragile. And laughed. Because I was never fragile. I was quiet. Steady. Powerful. Like a tide. Not loud, but impossible to stop once it started moving. I emailed Lila back the next morning. "Let's talk." The next few weeks moved in quiet momentum. We signed a pilot deal with the Washington State Library System, 12 rural branches where internet connections were slower than goats, and community tech was a dream spoken in future tense. We built starter kits for veterans, caregivers, and people transitioning into assisted living. We launched the Digital Dignity Campaign, a national call for recognizing seniors not as burdens but as beings still becoming. Jamie helped me design the graphics. "I didn't know advocacy could feel like this," she said one day, eyes wide, "like building something that actually listens." "It's always felt like that to me," I replied. "I just didn't know it was allowed to be seen." By the end of the quarter, ElderPath had doubled its users. Testimonials came in from Kentucky, New Mexico, Minnesota. One man emailed to say he used ElderPath to submit a resume, his first in 30 years. I didn't get the job, he wrote, but I remembered how it felt to try. I saved that one in a folder called Real Wins. We didn't make headlines, we didn't go viral. But every time someone logged in, asked a question, hit send, for the first time we expanded. Not just in reach, in meaning. And for once, I allowed myself to feel it. Not as a fluke, not as something I had to explain, but as a life. Lived fully, built quietly, and now seen. We called it the Digital Dignity Campaign. It wasn't flashy, no celebrity endorsements, no billboards in Times Square, just a soft blue logo, a mission that spoke in full sentences, and a belief that dignity doesn't expire with age, it just gets harder to access in a world built to overlook it. We launched in 14 states, public libraries, veterans' homes, community centers in neighborhoods that hadn't seen new tech since dial-up. We offered workshops, training hubs, free access to ElderPath's full suite. No ads, no paywalls. Just one goal: help people stay connected to their lives, their families, and themselves. Within weeks, the platform crossed 250,000 active users. I should have felt triumphant. But all I felt was grounded. The numbers were nice, but they weren't what stayed with me. What stayed was the woman in Kansas who used ElderPath to order groceries on her own for the first time since her hip surgery. The man in Vermont who sent a birthday video to his great-granddaughter because handwriting was too painful now. The nurse in Alabama who used our system to set up daily check-ins for a memory care wing. Every testimonial was a thread. Every login was a heartbeat. And still I didn't post about it. I didn't tag news outlets or give interviews. Instead, I walked to the post office one Friday morning and mailed a small package to an address I had scribbled down months ago, the assisted living facility where Mrs. Ellis had spent her final years. Inside was a custom-built version of ElderPath. The design was tailored to that facility's needs: large print menus, simplified navigation, photo-based logins. We included training materials, onboarding support, and a direct tech line, all pre-funded, no expiration. Along with it, a simple handwritten note. Some connections outlive misunderstanding. Thank you for helping mine find her voice. I addressed it to Lila and Grant. No signature, no expectation, just a bridge built in silence from one soul to another. That evening, I walked by the pier, the one not far from my apartment, where the sea mist drifted like a secret only the sky could keep. The wind carried salt and pine, familiar now, like a second skin. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder what my mother would say. I didn't replay conversations that had already turned to dust. I just walked one foot in front of the other until the city lights behind me blurred into soft memory. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was becoming. I felt like I had arrived, not at success, not at vindication, but at truth. I thought about the version of me who left med school in silence, carrying shame in one hand and freedom in the other. I thought about the library basements, the sticky cafe tables, the trembling hands that hit send for the first time. I thought about Jamie and Ruth and June and Mrs. Ellis. I thought about every moment that didn't make the family newsletter. And I realized this, all of it, was the life I'd been quietly building while they weren't looking. Not in rebellion, not for revenge, but because something inside me knew that I was meant to build bridges, not fit into blueprints someone else drew up long ago. Back home, I taped a quote to my refrigerator. It wasn't elegant. Just black ink on a torn piece of printer paper. They'll tell you failed until one day they ask how you did it. No name, no framing, just truth. And below it, the faint reflection of my face in the fridge door. Smiling, solid, seen. Because this time, the light wasn't coming from anyone else. It was mine, all along.